Good evening and welcome to the Council Committee work session for Monday, October 22nd. This is the first of the much discussed, long anticipated, excited budget 2019 budget deliberation conversations. We have 3 hours scheduled for this evening. We will be taking public comment, but because this is all sort of one big presentation, I am going to take public comment at the end. So that's when we will be taking public comment this evening. So with that, I am going to turn it over to City Administrator Moon.
Thank you. Happy to be here tonight. I was so excited about talking about revenue that I just jumped in on Ruth's public hearing earlier to get right to the big stuff. We have two presentations that we're going to walk through tonight. First is just to give some background on council responsibilities, our intents on what we're going to present, set the table, so to speak. So this is our high-level schedule. This is the schedule that was presented in the Budget in Brief document, which is posted online. Remind council that a more detailed schedule was given to you on October 1st, and it attempts to lay out topics in a tentative, anticipated way for each evening, so you have a little bit more of that information. Our ultimate goal is, of course, we need to adopt the budget by December 31st. I also wanted to point out on this slide that on November 5th, where it says first public hearing on preliminary budget, that we also anticipate will include a moment in time where we bring forward the salary ordinance, which will describe the classifications and salary ranges. And we'd anticipate perhaps taking adoption on that at the same date as the final budget, December 3rd. So state law describes what we need to give to you in the public in terms of a budget. On the revenue side, we need to provide actuals from the prior complete year. That's 2017. We need to provide year-end estimate for the current year we're in, estimate for 2019, what we're anticipating for revenues, and we need to more specifically include the ad valorem, and we reported on that earlier this evening, and also the unencumbered fund balance. On the expenditure side, we are required by state law to give you totals for each fund and every department within each fund. And that data is to include, again, actuals, revised adopted budget for the current year, and the proposed 2019 budget. I earlier mentioned we also have to give you the salary or range of costs for each classification and a budget message, which the mayor delivered last week. Two keyboards, this is going to get me all night long. State law also describes the final budget as final form budget, and that style of budget needs to show the estimated revenue and appropriations for each separate fund and the aggregate total, the total city budget that includes all funds. And then at a high level, it describes the authority of the council as being to approve the total amount appropriated for each fund, and that's what constitutes approved expenditures, and that's without regard to the individual items that are within it. And so that's the language that we often talk about when we say that you have authority at the fund level. Another term that we use often, yes?
I'm sorry to interrupt. Could you please go back?
Yep.
So the total amount appropriated for each fund constitutes the approved expenditures without regard to the individual items contained therein. I want to make sure I understand the intent of that comment. I've always viewed this as there's really multiple components to the budget. Of course, there is what you talked about here, the appropriations per fund. And of course, we can summarize that in one page.
Yes,
but our budget documents are 190 pages.
correct.
And there is a lot of background information, but there's work plan information,
Sure.
there's staffing information, there are capital projects in there. And outside of the fund balance appropriations, I've always viewed all of these other elements, and many that I didn't mention, as policy, budget policy. And so though there's a technicality that we only approve an
Correct.
appropriation at the fund level, but in essence, though, we are also adopting quite a bit of policy.
Absolutely,
Right.
absolutely. And again, this is just what the state law says in this section on the budget. There are other laws that require you to actually approve of different kinds of expenditures, land transactions, those sorts of things. So there's other state laws that reference individual authority and appropriations. So this was overly simplified. And having said that, yes, we still provide you with a whole lot more information because we know in order to make good decisions in the macro, you need to also understand the bits and pieces that comprise the whole. And it sets direction for the city in our delivery of services. Absolutely.
you.
So a couple terms, we talk about a balanced budget. There's a couple ways the state defines this term per state law. It's when appropriations are limited to the total estimated revenues, including the unencumbered fund balance. So it says you may use savings from prior years, and if you do, it still constitutes a balanced budget. However, what we aim to develop every year is what we would call a structurally balanced budget. And that is also defined in state statute, and it's when all of our ongoing expenses are met by recurring revenues. So we don't rely on fund balance. Still, we have opportunities to use fund balance for one-time appropriations, and that is an absolutely fine way to fund many one-time items. And state law says you should conduct a couple hearings, 3 hearings actually, and establish our property rate, approve those salary ranges and classifications, and adopt that final form budget. However, because it is policy-based as well, we have desired actions that we usually take you through every budget season. These are the desired actions from the point of view of mayor and city administration. So the first is we like to review in-depth estimated revenues, the spending plans for the funds and departments. We like to highlight the major changes because we looked at every little detail of the budget. There's changes in multiple places. And we have a policy question in front of you in this budget, and that's what the operational model should be for the senior center going forward. We're going to talk about that in a later budget work session as well. As the 2019 capital projects, we have some unfunded projects. We have some projects that are planned for year 1 in our CIP, which will now be 2019. And the mayor and I have recommended an increase to the Arch Housing Trust Fund contribution, and I had said during budget deliberations we'd come back to that and have that conversation. Some other desired actions are to review the work plan. We're going to cover items that are in it and some items that were left out this year. We had a confined budget. We had a limited amount of new revenue, and that forced us to make some decisions about which projects we would pursue. We're also asking to present the staffing needs that we have and asking for your support for our staffing recommendations. We're looking to review the city gives funding, that's community fund, human services, grants, some other ways in which we contribute to local nonprofits in particular, and asking you to approve those recommendations. We will discuss the possible use of general fund balance. Again, this budget did not utilize any. And we'll talk a little bit at the end about our 2019 plan to analyze some of the design of our funds, move forward on more cost allocation, and move funds in the direction of greater sustainability. So overall, this is our plan for the presentations going forward. We're going to spend time on revenues. We're going to review fund and department totals. We're going to highlight the big things in the budget. We're going to talk about the mayor's people and tools strategy, which was the framework for our budget development, and talk about 2019's plan and how that fits with our long-range planning model and those areas that it appears are going to need more attention going forward into the next year. So that's first presentation. Called overview. We're moving to the second one.
Any questions so far? Other questions?
It's called. There should be a folder on the desktop.
Overview. There you go. And then,
Okay. So the second presentation that we're going to make tonight is
how do I do that?
more meaty in terms of turning our attention to numbers.
Is it this one?
And
Nope. Which one do I do?
Closed master view?
Where's that at? Oops.
Back under
Back.
slide master. Over on the right-hand side, there's a red.
Oh,
There
thank
we
you.
go.
Nope.
okay, good. Thanks, Lisa. Thank you. Okay, and as Christina gets seated, the first thing that we're going to do is talk a little bit about what's new and different this year in terms of our process and budget format. So I'm going to turn it over to Christina Reller.
Hi. I'm Christina Reller, one of the financial operations managers. I wanted to take a moment to walk you through what the budget process has looked like and is going to look like. This is a multi-step, multi-year journey to improve the budget process. We are looking at setting up a process with best practices, policies and procedures that contribute to improve our government management. Part of that has included the department restructure, which has aligned our accounting division, the revenue division, and budgeting division to better align with some of those services to enhance and utilize our expertise. And it will allow us to better align with the strategic plan as that comes to completion early next year. We've also implemented new software. That's included the financial system, and also in progress is our new budget development system, Issaquah. And that will allow us in time to also align with our strategic plan, and we'll be able to tie some of these new strategic initiatives along with the plan. Part of best practices has allowed us the opportunity to restructure our chart of accounts. This has been a twofold process. We started a few years ago with restructuring from a long account to a short account. I believe that we went from 10,000 accounts down to 3. We still, in this last year, went through another restructuring, and that was to align with our reporting that is regulated by BARS, our state mandate. That allows us to, I guess, better reporting. And we've been able to follow the federal and state requirements for cost allocation, setting up for cost allocation. And the accrual method of accounting was established 3 or 4 years ago. We went from cash basis to accrual basis. This new format in finance has given us the opportunity to have better perspective with long-range planning, to work more with the finance committee, ad hoc committee, long-range planning. It's been allowed us time to comply with fiscal policy, allow more interdepartmental collaboration, and will allow us more engagement with the departments, but also with the community. We've been able to adopt a 5-year CIP, and including the first 2 years in a biennial budget. That's allowed us in this off year to do the chart of accounts and do some of that extra work. We were able to work with IT to fund the IT, I guess the new internal not internal service, it's a new internal service fund for IT, and develop the cost allocation plan, and we'll further that development through, we'll talk about it later in the workshops, but with fleet and refine some of those allocations with other areas. Part of what you'll see in this new process is a new document. Our previous historical documents have been very manual, and although useful, and we want to contribute and continue some of those informative pieces, we're looking to use the system, have the departments utilize the system, get the information out to them faster, help with management decisions, executive decisions, and get that turnaround time a little faster and a little more deliberate, a little more strategic in many ways. So you'll see some of our standardization has included terminology. We're talking about the preliminary budget, which has had different forms and terms in the past, like draft or proposed. We've tried to simplify. It may not look like it's simplified, but it is. It's also allowing us, as we go through this process, we will have the opportunity to have what's called open book. It's more interactive. It's outward facing, and you can engage different levels of the community, different levels of the organization, so we're looking forward to that. It also has a component of performance metrics, performance management. We're looking forward to that component and getting that as part of our normal City of Issaquah process. It's giving us a different level of organizational reporting and feedback, and it's giving us a process for review. And part of that is here with council and the workshops, and being able to provide different levels of information to you. So we look forward to this process, and thank you.
Questions so far? Councilmember Winterstein?
I may be ahead of the game, so I'm sure you'll tell me if I am. At
Okay.
what point are you going to explain the, I'll use the multi-org summary structure that's in the preliminary budget document?
Sure, we can talk about that a little bit. Would you like to do that?
That is part of, was the long account, went to a short account, which is the org code. It's basically, I don't want to call it a costing center, but it is an organizational component. There can be several organization codes in a department. Some are, it's the difference between some are departments and some are funds themselves, but it is based on the fund, where it's at. So,
Okay, I
so
think
the org summary will align and help align with the strategic plan, so they should be standalone
Okay.
accounts.
Now, I think I might know enough to understand that. You changed the chart of accounts. We have a cost center, and it sounds like you have an org component as well. Maybe that's another segment, or not. Maybe it's within that. But this is now what's reflected in this reporting. I can see that you've done the budget using that new structure.
Yep.
But we don't have anything to compare it against. You can't kind of go back and see the same level of information now into year-over-year comparison. So I'm not asking that you make that possible, but I will need, as we go through this, some help because last few years is the basis that we have. And with this new structure and the way this data is now broken out, we don't have a ready comparison to previous years at all at this level.
I believe you have something pretty close. So
Okay.
instead of looking at the pages that are marked multiple org summary, which is a lovely descriptive header that Questica gave us, you can instead look at the budget expenditure comparison summary, which is organized in the same fashion that we have done before. So you can look at city clerk, city facilities. There are, if you go back further than 2017 actuals that we gave you, then yes, that will be a little bit more complicated, and I'll give you an example of that. We've renamed some functions in order to get them into sort of these cost allocation buckets, but we can help show you a map for that. But we've given you at least the ability to compare the 2018 budget and the 2017 actuals with what's proposed for 2019.
Okay, so thank you. So that's starting on page 5, titled The Budget Expenditure Comparison Summary.
Correct.
And since you brought that up, of the, I don't know what you're going to call these, departments/funds, but within these, city facilities, I'm going to list a couple of them off here, and I can give them to you via email. City facilities, non-departmental, emergency management, streets, and special revenue funds, debt service, capital projects, internal service, those don't map back to last year.
Correct.
That's where you're going to have to help
They're
us.
different titles.
Well, they're not
They combine some groups in some cases.
Okay, so-
Emergency management, for example, was a division under Public Works Ops.
Okay, so that's the kind of help I'm going to ask.
Okay.
I recognize that there was some reorganization, restructure, recoding that was done. We're seeing it all in the new structure, but I need, even at this summary level, starting on page 5.
Right.
But as I tried to go back, and I just pulled up last year's budget document, yes, many of those organizations are there, but this clearly is a blend of, I think as Christine mentioned, some funds and some departments.
Sure.
So-
So what we could do is we could give you we could map these new units to where they were budgeted before. What may be more difficult for us is to take past year's budgets and then break them into these new parts
And
Go back
I
and
know
try to
that's
do that.
very difficult to do when you've recoded things. So
Okay.
a mapping at this point is all I would ask for.
Great. Thank you.
Other questions right now?
Thank you.
Please proceed.
All right, so tonight we're going to focus on the general fund. This is a year-end kind of snapshot showing what we had as the originally adopted budget. Then we brought forward a budget amendment in August, and then we asked departments to estimate where they're going to be at year-end. I will tell you, that is their best guess. We have some departments that do an excellent job at that guesswork, and we have others that we're growing their sophistication in helping to create those year-end estimates. I tell you that because we then utilize a snapshot like that to look at fund balance. And fund balance it changes every day. It's wholly dependent on what we are receiving in revenue and what we're expending, and that does change over time. So right now, in this budget, we are forecasting that our revenues are going to be better than expected and budgeted by $2.31 million, and our expenditures are going to be less than what we expected by $4.44 million. I will tell you that 4.44 is 8.5% on top of is 8.5% of what the amended budget was for expenditures. That's a fairly high return to fund balance in my book. And again, still a product of where departments believe they're going to end the year. I expect that will change some. Can't say which way, positive or negatively. But we are going to go through an effort this coming year to, again, get better at doing those estimations, but also at looking at our expenditures throughout the year so that we're better able to understand what we may need to bring back to you in a budget amendment and what we may not need to. And there were things in the August amendment that we held back because we could clearly see that we had the capacity to fund those things. And so they weren't part of the budget amendments. We're making progress. If you look at the bottom chart there, we started the year, in August during the retreat, we had estimated the ending fund balance for 2018 to be $16.7 million. If you add on top of that the return to fund balance that we're anticipating now, that would give us a beginning fund balance for 2019 of $23.46 million. That is a healthy fund balance.
I'm sorry, Councilmember Ramos?
Yeah, just going to go back up to the upper chart there.
Sure.
The last column in percent there, the 4.5% and the 8.4%. Just to be clear, to me, that's kind of like a positive and negative. So the 4.5% is an increase over expected revenue, and this 8.5% is a decrease in expenditures of what was expected, right?
Yeah,
So even they're both looking like positive numbers, but they're kind of in a sense at two different ends of the spectrum, right? So,
correct. It's actually, it's taking, in the case of the 4.44, it's taking the $52 million that was the amended budget, and it's saying what percent
you spent
of that is returning to fund balance,
Right.
and that's the 8.5.
Right, so we spent 8.5% less than anticipated, plus we got more revenue, 4.5% more than anticipated, so that's where that $6 million got to be a pretty big number because we're adding those together. That's all I'm just trying to say, so it doesn't look like they're both pluses or both minuses, right?
No, they don't balance each other out.
They actually add
Correct.
to each other,
Correct.
right? That's why the 2.3 and the 4.4 add up to 6.75.
Correct.
Great, thank you,
Correct.
just clarifying.
Yeah. We're going to spend more time in a subsequent presentation on, actually next Monday, talking about the return to fund balance, and we're going to break that down for you a little bit more. On the expenditure side, what I can say about that 2.31 return to fund balance on the revenue side, it's largely from two places. It's property tax, so increased valuations, new construction, additional value, and therefore additional tax that's coming to the city, and sales and use tax, so higher than expected sales and use tax revenue. A little lesser extent coming from utility tax and building permits. This is just my graphic to illustrate that fund balance does change over time. I wanted to give you just an example of this. At the end of the budget season in 2016, as we were adopting the 2017 budget, our beginning fund balance was $15 million. A year from that point, we came back together and were ready to adopt the 2018 budget. And at that point, we projected the 2017 ending fund balance $1.5 million higher. We had the retreat in August, and we looked at 2017 actual fund balance, and it was $18 million, and so on. And so this is just meant to illustrate that fund balance is on the move. It's on the move in, I think, a good direction. It's going up. That's shows the health of the city and our local economy. But it's a snapshot in time. It changes every time we take a look at it and do that math to look at expenditures and revenues. So here's just a little bit more of that general fund return to fund balance broken down. If we look at the increased revenue, I spoke about this already, property tax, sales and use. One other piece that I didn't mention earlier was unanticipated grant revenue. I think this was the result of a parks capital project that I believe probably was anticipated but not fully recorded within the budget at the time of adoption. And so we were off by that. And then on the under expenditures, you can see that half of that came from position vacancies, or as we filled positions, if we hired a less experienced, more junior person into a position where we had a retirement of a more senior person, they may have started on our pay scale at a lower place. We also had professional services in our budget that we underexpended. That sometimes is because we got bids that were less. We were able to do the project for less than we had thought, or we didn't complete a project, and that project either got done in-house or we may be asking for it to be reappropriated in 2019, and we'll talk about those projects in the next budget meeting.
And I think Councilmember Ray has a
So
question.
can I just get some clarification, and I don't need it tonight, but at some point, I can find the property tax change, I can find the retail sales and use tax change. I'm having a difficult time in the detail finding the unanticipated grant revenue, and just like to be able to understand where that's coming from. That would be very helpful. Thank you.
Absolutely. Next.
I'm sorry,
Yeah,
another
I'm
question
sorry.
from Council Deputy President Batiste.
Thank you. Just with the retail sales and use tax, just having that be a little bit unexpected, did you say that was sort of on the use tax side of things? Was there, I was just wondering if there was any more information? And it can
We
be a question.
can examine that and see if we can get better detail. I just have it as the whole category.
Okay, thank you.
Please proceed.
Thank you. Okay, so this is a breakdown of the entire budget by fund, sort of the same information we've talked about with general fund. And you can see the amended budget for each fund, take water at the top there, where we're projecting to end the year. That's the variance. And then on the right-hand side, you can see BFB is beginning fund balance. So you can see where we started with the fund at the beginning of this budget year, and then the projected increase or decrease to that fund balance based on revenues and expenditures throughout the year, and also based on where we actually began the 2018 year in fund balance, as opposed to maybe just the adopted anticipated start of fund balance for that fund. And then you can see how that results in the 2019 beginning fund balance, which is shown in your preliminary budget.
Councilmember Ray.
So just picking on water for just a second. So if I'm reading this correctly, and I'm not saying that I am, we had $1.57 million more in revenue than we anticipated, and we had expenditures of $30,000 more than we anticipated. How did we end up with a negative in projected increase or decrease? I would think we'd have a positive.
Yes, again, this is, I think, what we probably should have given you is the revised beginning fund balance for 2018. I think that's the difference, that perhaps that $12 million was the beginning fund balance where we were when we adopted the budget, and where we're actually at now in the anticipated fund balance for that fund. Then you bring in those budget variances from revenue and expenditures, and you arrive at the math on the right. Do you have anything to add? No.
If you could just make the math for me somehow, it would make me so happy.
We can work on that, sure.
And I appreciate this new format in terms of where the information is located, and maybe my fellow council members would disagree, but I personally, it would be easier if increases in a fund, positive to fund is positive and negative to fund has got parenthesis around it, just
Sure.
broadly.
Okay, really, really good. Yeah, I think the big takeaway is that column on that far left of the amended budget. It would probably be helpful for us to show you what the original adopted was, because that's the piece that's kind of missing at this point of the story. Okay, and then we've also given you the big macro views on these funds as well. Street operating, which is largely funded through general fund type revenue sources, and a couple more utility funds here, sewer and stormwater. You will see in some of these funds where we have an anticipated decrease to the fund balance. We'll be coming back to those funds in your work session in November to talk about what that means long-term. Some of these funds, the sewer and stormwater, for example, on this page, are mixed operating and capital funds now. You'll recall we combined those last year. And so in some cases, we're taking from fund balance in order to pre-fund projects on the capital side.
Yeah, I would be particularly interested when we have that conversation to understand to what extent we've been unable to execute our capital spend the way that we hope to, and what's going on with that and how it might look different in 2019.
Okay.
Questions?
All right, I'm moving from looking in the rearview mirror, I'm looking forward to 2019. The mayor's budget focus at the start of the budget was for us as staff to ensure that we could maintain service levels and quality of service. And the direction was to limit new requests. And the reason for that is because we're undertaking strategic plan right at this moment, and we want to have that framework in mind before we start major initiatives, new programs or service areas. And so she said, this is a maintenance budget. This is sort of a roll forward budget. Let's do what we're doing and let's do it as well as we can in 2019, but let's not take on major new things. Having said that, Mayor also became aware of needs in terms of additional staffing and additional resources for staff. So she called it her people and tools focus. And we'll talk more about that, particularly next workshop. But that was the framework that staff members used as we developed the budget. We wanted to talk to you just a little bit about the tool or the people side of this framework, and we wanted to share a little staffing history with you. This is the reason why departments asked for a certain number of positions and why the mayor chose to include some new staffing in her proposed budget. This is only meant to illustrate history. It's not meant to describe what should have been or what could have been. So illustrative only. The trend line versus actual graph displays both the authorized FTE numbers for city staff and a projection based on historical data. The authorized FTEs does not equate to the number that you might see in a budget. We've taken a look and tried to combine in past years limited term employees, so LTEs, with FTEs, and you'll recall only a couple years ago we started breaking out LTEs from FTEs in a way that you could track both pools. The historical data we took from city's budget documents 2005 to 2018, and that contained some FTE data as far back as 1996. You can go back and verify what really happened in each of those years. This is budget data, not actuals. So the numbers from 1996 to 2009 were used to create a pre-recession trend line where FTE growth averaged 3.6% a year over that 14-year span. We then projected out that trend line until 2019, that's the dashed blue line, to depict what the FTE population could have been without the Great Recession, without, lots of caveats there, right? The actual FTE data from 2009 to 2018 is shown in red, and it shows the FTEs that were authorized in each year's budget, with an additional data point for what's proposed in 2019. So Then if you look at those two trend lines, had staffing trend continued post-recession, then that growth in staff would have been 26% during that time. Instead, you can see that we responded to the Great Recession by reducing staff and have largely kept those staffing levels constant until just recently as we added back some positions, and we are now roughly at where we were at that recession point.
Councilmember Ray.
So I know you said this and I just missed it. So LTEs or limited term positions, we're not putting in this calculation. So there's some level of staffing above the red line that reflects the term limited folk, right?
Let me explain that a little bit differently, better, hopefully. LTs have been included in the most recent years from, let's say, 2012-ish. I believe we may not have LTEs broken out in a way that was easy for us to pull that data. Having said that, we have gone back and we've looked at some budget data that shows that it would have been only a handful of positions. So we didn't have in 2000, let's say, an extra 200 LTEs. It would have been a small number. It would not have changed this trend line significantly.
Councilmember Winterstein?
Thank you. This chart is interesting. It may tell a lot of different stories. One way to understand the data a little bit better would be if we could see this data by department. Reason, because I think, if my memory serves me, not all departments have scaled with city growth like others have. For example, I know for a fact that Parks has stayed really flat for a long time. It would be easy to look at Parks and saying, how are you keeping up with all these new properties that you have? But other areas, we've created new ones and we've done some shifting around, but police has been one where we have incrementally been adding resources over time.
Yes.
So this is an aggregate story about headcount.
Yep.
But I think the story about our ability to scale our services to meet a growing community and where we're maybe falling behind and where we're maybe are up to date is more clear when we look at the department level.
Sure, and that's an excellent point. I will also say, as you mentioned, we've added different divisions, we've added different programs, we've consolidated staff in different ways, we've moved them across department lines as we've moved programmatic areas from one department to another. That analysis is complex to get to apples so that you could see those changes. There are departments where it's easier. Police department is very, very easy to look at historically. And I think you make an excellent point of have we just been selective about which departments we have added staff to and which departments we have maybe contracted. And you're right, that's not up on this slide. This was just meant to illustrate a total.
And thank you for that. But just so you know that whereas I find this data interesting, as one of the council members, I look at that and say, but I think the story lies elsewhere. Because I know things happen with DSD, things happen with Public
Sure.
Works Engineering,
Sure.
And there's stories behind all of those. And so what this doesn't do for me, and I don't know if this was the intent or not, but it's like, hey, we've been very conservative. There has been growth. We haven't kept pace from a staffing perspective. I'm not saying you were intended this or not, but it's like, okay, here's kind of we're setting things up for the ask that's in here. I don't know, but for me, the better story is when we look at the department level. So
Sure, and
doesn't really-
the only thing that I would add to that is I'm not aware, and I have shorter tenure than you do, but I'm not aware of departments that we have stopped doing or major services that we have stopped providing either. I hear your point, and if at some point as we do make that ask, if there's a need to look at apples to apples staffing growth in a particular department or service area, we can talk about providing that information.
We can go back if
Okay.
needed, yes.
Great.
Councilmember Ray.
So the other thing that strikes me, and this will just skew the numbers, but did you factor out Eastside Fire and Rescue when we ended our fire department? Because we actually did end our fire department.
Yep.
So, yeah, and you can see a dip in 99.
That's correct.
Yeah, so I just want to make sure that we accounted for that too.
Absolutely.
Other questions right now? Oop, all
Great,
right.
thank you. So next, we're just going to overlay that on population as well. And same sort of story here in terms of population has grown 40% since that same moment in time in the last decade. And again, staffing level has stayed roughly the same. Again, this is just meant to illustrate that the trends on staffing against population growth and how that ratio has not kept pace with population growth over that time. But again, we can look at it at service levels and talk about units of service that we're attempting to deliver in each group. All right, so departments are feeling that it's more difficult each year to keep up with service demands, and that resulted in, for all the years of my tenure here, quite a few asks in the budget development process. This year we had nearly or approximately 30 positions, new positions that were requested during budget development. We have significantly reduced that, and what's shown in your preliminary budget. Those totaled nearly $5 million of cost. That is not what we ended up in the preliminary budget, and we're going to cover that in greater detail next Monday. On the tools side of the people and tools framework for the budget, there were 50 projects that were submitted. These are all technology-based projects. We certainly had other small equipment, fleet requests as well, and we reduced that. So we started with a budget ask of over $1 million, and we are only able to afford a fraction of that. And we'll talk more about that on the 29th as well. So as we look to build the budget, we do go back and take a look at what our long-term financial forecasts had to say about where we thought we would be in 2019. And this slide illustrates that. The baseline scenario that we utilized in August for our financial retreat had estimated the total general fund revenue at $52.6 million and a use of fund balance. As you can see from the preliminary budget, we're pretty close to what that financial forecast had estimated, but between the different categories there are slight differences, and then we are not utilizing any fund balance in this preliminary budget. On the expenditures side, again, a pretty similar picture. Baseline scenario had us at $52.8 million, and preliminary has us just a shade under that. Again, a little bit of deviation in categories, in particular, some of our transfer categories like street and capital projects are up, and our other operating is the bulk of the budget. It's all the staffing, it's supplies, it's services, dollars. This is the way that we showed it in the baseline scenario to model it, and so that's the way it is shown here. We will be showing you the budget in greater detail and in different ways as we go forward. Other transfers, in case you're wondering, includes transfers to the Sustainability Fund, Unemployment Fund, and water utility fund for the Main Street tax program. The other thing that we do as we develop the budget is we look back to our financial management policies, and we do a little check to make sure that our proposed budget is meeting those policy targets, or that we're identifying places where we are going to need to spend more time and effort to get in line with those policy targets. So these are the big ones. General fund balance target policy is that we have 15 to 20% of our expenditures, and we are significantly over that as projected now. We also have a financial management policy that our ongoing expenditures are funded by ongoing revenues, and we've done that by not using fund balance in this preliminary budget. Next, we have a goal around debt that we limit it to 1.5% of the city's total assessed value. And at the end of last year, and this is data that was presented to you at the financial retreat, city had about $8 million of outstanding councilmanic debt. That's non-voted debt. And so therefore, we have still $144 million available in councilmanic debt capacity. Having said that, that's not necessarily sustainable, not something that we can afford, but we're meeting that target very easily. And then we put one up here to be transparent about the fact that we do have some work to get in line with our financial management policies, particularly as they relate to internal service funds. The policy says that we shall have a reserve target, but staff has not brought forward a suggestion for what those reserve targets should be, and council has not adopted a reserve level for those internal service funds. In order to do that, we also have some operating budget work to do in order to establish what capital replacement plans are going to look like in a few of these funds. We give 2 examples here, or the overall structure of the fund, or the cost allocation, cost accounting between funds that sets up the structure for those funds. So we have a bunch of work to do better budgeting in some of our smaller funds, and in particular those funds that help us to keep our infrastructure going.
So I have a question around that. So as I look at this, a lot of this I think is great in terms of the kinds of things that we want to look at year over. The thing that is maybe missing or not missing, I'm not sure. When you talk about capital replacement, I think, I mean, you mentioned IT and fleet. I think back to former council member Cher, who would always talk about, you know, our drained play surfaces, right?
Right.
And the fact that at some point they're going to have to be replaced, and the mechanism, you know,
Yep.
to drive towards a goal of being able to say, you know, we are, you know, depreciating these assets by a certain amount each year, and understanding
Right.
where that is. And that's the only piece of this that I think as a dashboard of wellness, that's the piece I feel like is maybe missing. So when you talk about capital depreciation, you're talking about some very specific smaller fund things, but I think there's also a conversation about things that are in the general fund or in some of the larger funds. Do you agree?
Sure, and I think you were talking about the turf replacement capital projects.
I said it
so-
wrong, but,
yeah,
but
I-
that type of
Sure.
large ongoing, things that were wonderful that we put in, but that we don't
Right.
presently budget their replacements until they need to be replaced.
And so some of those we're tackling through our capital budget. Others, I'll explain these two in a little bit better detail. For example, both IT and fleet cost allocations right now, their budgets are built around the operating expenses for the next year. So we look at, in IT's case, what's the operating budget for our IT staff and for the repairs and maintenance work that we may need to do and the special projects for that year. But if we look at PC replacement, we have not fully built out a replacement plan that then adds an increment to every year's budget in order to make sure that we're keeping up with the replacement schedule. We have periodically over the last few years put a chunk of cash into the budget in order to get caught up on replacements or to begin a fund. But we haven't every year put aside the right increment of money that we need to keep on pace with that. The same is true with fleet replacement. We have not done a robust replacement plan, and we're dealing with replacements on an annual basis. What's due that year, and can we afford it this year?
Any other questions right now?
Okay, we also wanted to take a look at revenue over time. This is revenue per capita in 2018 dollars. The source of this data is the annual financial statement from each year from 2003 to 2016. And for 2017 through 2019 data, we use information from budgets since we don't have certified annual reports yet for those years. We provide this in the aggregate as opposed to individual department totals because we think it's a simplified way to look at it. To produce this actual curve, we took the revenue in each of those years and converted it to 2018 dollars. We did that using the Consumer Price Index from Bureau of Labor Statistics for Seattle, and we used the August 2018 CPI. Let's see, what else? So while our total revenues have grown over time, our population has also changed, and that's what causes this curve to peak around 2004, when there were only about 15,500 people in Issaquah, and today there are over 37,000. However, one important takeaway from this graph is that the revenues per capita have been relatively flat from 2010 to 2019. And the 2019 projection uses the budget data that we have in the preliminary budget, but also factors in a 2.2% increase in inflation and a 3% growth in population. That's what we've averaged over the last 6 years. So there have been significant revenue impacts statewide since 1999. Some examples of that have been an initial repeal of the motor vehicle excise tax, property tax limitation, and of course the Great Recession. City property tax collection has been below the rate of inflation. City has not added a new significant revenue source during that time period either, although we have made adjustments, of course, to fine and fee structures. We had an increase in B&O tax rate, and we've certainly had special bond levies, for example.
Question
Sure.
Councilmember Winterstein.
on
Go back.
revenue?
Yep.
What revenues are you talking about?
I believe these are total revenues, but
Not from the enterprise funds.
don't believe so. Total general fund.
Just general fund?
Okay, likewise, expenditure per capita here, same methodology that I explained earlier. Expenditures have a similar drop from the early peak around 2004 when our population growth took off, but our spending stayed relatively flat proportionally from 2010 to 2019. I will say that this requires effort, of course, to maintain this curve, and expenditure management has always been a priority of this city, but those macroeconomic conditions and a need to provide services for a growing population, and the fact that We are a service organization, and so a huge chunk of our budget is related to personnel costs, and we all know those haven't stayed flat, particularly when you look at the cost of providing health benefits. So city governments, just like ours, are always challenged with expenditures that grow faster than revenues. And in Washington State, municipalities like Issaquah are particularly dependent on economic development to drive increase in revenue that therefore can support increased need on the expenditure side.
Councilmember Ray.
So it really would be helpful for me, and again, nothing tonight, but if you could give me the actual numbers, the table of the numbers instead of the chart, that would be super helpful.
Okay.
Thank you.
Councilmember Winterstein and then Councilmember Hunt. Or Councilmember Hunt and then Councilmember Winterstein.
On 2017, you mentioned that that one is from the budget, it's not the actual,
Oh, 18.
or is it just 2018? Okay.
2017, because it's not certified yet in our CAFR, our financial report.
Okay, so even though it's not certified, and we know for 2018, for example, that the difference in the revenue there's going to be some difference in the revenue versus what was budgeted, because 2017, it would be good to know what it is, although it's not certified, to get a sense for how much that varies for the budgeted versus the actual.
Sure.
Councilmember Winterstein.
2 comments. First, both this slide and the previous one, I think those are amazing curves, actually. The fact that the per capita numbers could stay flat. And my second comment is, it's not coincidental, it's when the longest tenured members of this council actually started serving.
I forgot to put that in my
We've been doing a great
remarks.
job the last 8, 9 years.
Clearly you can see a before and an after.
Right. And then we just put them together because they look nice together.
So I'd like to comment on this, a couple of
Sure.
things. First of all, I completely agree with Councilmember Winterstein, especially since I'm the one who asked for these numbers. But this really does, when people ask, are you just spending as much money as, government? They just want to spend all of our money. Well, no, we provide services, and over time, those services in real dollars as we scale the organization have been flat for some time. The second thing is that, of course, that there's no hockey stick for 2018, 2019, and that this maintenance budget that the mayor has submitted is, in fact, it tells that story here. And then I want to mention that an important factor is that by defining real dollars on CPI, it also sort of takes out the benefit that the community has seen by increased housing prices. In other words, the CPI is not driven off of housing prices, right? So if we were doing this on the back of the increase in housing value, then we would see this number trending up, right? This is real by making it on CPI. And then the final thing that I really like about this is there's only really 1 year where expenditures exceed revenues, right? Generally speaking, we've been able to keep expenditures at or below revenue, and that 1 year was in the midst as we were diving into the Great Recession. So I really like the fiscal restraint that this chart shows. That was before I was on council. So other questions? I see a quizzical look. Anything? No? All right.
Okay, and then we wanted to give you just the big picture look on the general fund. This is the revenue side, or what we refer to as resources often. This is the same pie chart that was in the budget in brief. You can see it's a big slice of purple up there that comes from taxes. Next largest increment is from charges for service. Charges for service are you can think of that as the user fees that participants or users of different services pay directly for those services. And Then I'm going to take that biggest slice of pie, that's taxes, and we're going to break that out a little bit. Ruth talked about this in her presentation as well. You can see that our biggest portion of taxes is coming from sales and use, which ebbs and flows with local and regional and even national economic conditions.
Just a quick question. Sure. So do we find, I mean, I just don't know, historically that property taxes are more stable and retail sales and use more volatile, or are they both fairly volatile, both fairly stable? I mean, that makes up the lion's share of the pie.
I can't speak historically for this community. I can say my experience elsewhere is that property tax is considered a stable source where sales and use is less so.
Can I ask how we made $110,000 off gambling?
It's a really good question.
I realize
I
it's
think
it's a very small amount. It just catches
isn't
my
there
eye.
state revenue share that's based on,
From what?
yeah.
Is that like scratch tickets or something?
Yes, Christine is telling me pull tabs and scratch games like lottery
Wow.
receipts. Yeah, okay.
There must be a lot more of that than I realized. All right, thank you.
Sure. And lastly, we wanted to show you the same sort of pie for expenditure side of the general fund. You can see salary and wages is the biggest slice of the pie. I'm having the management analysts do a little bit of research on this. I actually was quite surprised to see this below 50%. And so I'm posing some questions about whether or not that's the norm. For similar municipalities, it's lower than I've experienced. I think in part, if you look at combining other personnel, maybe a chunk from services where we're contracting out, instead, we get closer to a number that I would have expected. Help understand a few of these labels. Services is professional services, so again, contractual services. It includes our legal budget. It includes some of our communications, insurance, and utilities, payments from the general fund. Supplies is office supplies, small tools and equipment, computer hardware and software. The cost allocation, right now we have two cost allocations, that's IT and fleet. Intergovernmental is our funding of fire marshal position, King County Shoreline Patrol, Eastside Fire and Rescue, ARCH, workers' compensation services, election costs, a whole bucket of many small things. Other operating costs includes travel, rentals and leases, repairs and maintenance, scholarships and grants, training and registration, dues and subscriptions. And then other personnel is overtime and part-time non-regular wages, so our part-time staff. Again, a different way of looking at it, looking at our preliminary budget, and you'll see us use, we're still not using the right lingo everywhere. We'll say proposed sometimes and preliminary other times. They mean the same thing. So the preliminary budget versus 2018 adopted, and I'm stressing that. Charges for service, taxes, and transfers, we are projecting an increase, or have built into the budget an increase in revenue. But intergovernmental licenses and permits, we are projecting to be down some budget to budget. And here, in taxes, as we talked about, that's mainly coming from sales and use and a little bit from business and occupancy. Charges and services, that increase is mainly from plan check review services and recreation fees.
Councilmember, sorry, Councilmember.
She can finish the slide.
Okay. We're projecting a slight decrease, as you've seen on your revenue summary, in building permits. It's a conservative estimate. We tend to be conservative in that category because sometimes permits come in earlier than expected, sometimes they come in later. So that's really about timing, but we do analysis every year to look at what's in the pipeline and try to judge what permits they're going to apply for, what that will result in terms of permit revenue, and what's the timing on all of that. We're in a particularly challenging time, a good time to try to project revenue, but it is challenging because this is a period of unprecedented growth. But we do see some signs that some things are slowing down. And so we do tend to be conservative, prudent on estimating our revenues.
Councilmember Winterstein.
Thank you. Since you came back to revenue and I was one slide slow, Christina, or whomever's driving, could you go back 2 slides? Thank you. This was the taxes one. Okay, that's fine. Earlier this evening, we had a public hearing on revenue sources, and I've always found that a little bit misleading, so I just want to say this publicly. You can look at that. You can see we have components at our property tax. There's a component on sales tax. There's a component, another big one on business and occupation tax. There are other ways that we get for criminal justice, utility rates that are added to our bills for our utilities, like phone, for example. There's many different ways that we as a city can impact the numbers and the slices of each of these pies. But the only question in front of us in this budget season at all is the levy rate that the city charges for property taxes. That's it.
Correct, because...
I just want that should be the public hearing was titled Revenue Sources.
Right.
And that's, I don't know if it's intended to cover all the potential changes we could have. As you can look at, there's many ways that we could affect revenue, but the only one we're addressing is a potential 1% in property tax.
That's correct.
Haven't we, so I'm trying to remember, there are years that we have looked at B&O. Yep. But that wasn't part of the budget process? That was separate from the budget? Or was that part of the budget?
So some years it's been part, sometimes it's been separate. There's no rhyme or reason. We can do it either way. Other years, in addition to, you mentioned B&O as an example, we have offered suggestions to change, not on this slide, I'll show you this slide, some new policy and therefore new rate structures and fines and fees. So we have presented those options in the past. This particular budget, we don't have those recommendations in front of you. We lay out in the IMC, there's different rules governing these different sources and the time at which you can present recommendations to make changes.
Got it. So we're choosing this year, the administration is choosing to make that 1% recommendation and choosing not to suggest a change in B&O.
Correct. At this point in the year, I will also say, just to be fully transparent, that the mayor has some level of authority as well to make some adjustments on rates. For example, I think if you look at rec fees, she has the ability to adjust non-resident rates up to a certain % increase. So it depends on the revenue source.
So if we really get in a jam, those pool
Yeah.
fees, okay.
Right.
Got
Just
it.
as an example.
Thank you for that explanation.
Sure.
Other questions right now? Nope. Okay.
Okay, so that leads to the punchline. Yeah.
I do have one question on this one. Why are intergovernmental revenues down so significantly in 2019's preliminary budget?
In part, they're down due to state law changing on the streamlined sales tax. That's the biggest chunk.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
Was there disadvantageous rule change?
Yes.
Change?
Yes. I think the city's lobbyists had spoken about that, Doug Levy, over the course of the legislative session. It's a multi-year phase-in plan to reduce our revenue. And I can get you more information about how much is expected each year. I think this is the second to last year of that reduction, if I recall correctly. So that does lead us to punchline here, and this sets up the conversation for our next budget work session, where we will talk in greater depth about the expenditure side of the general fund. That $1.7 million of new revenue is the amount that we had to work with in the budget. So after the departments came and presented their 30 new staffing positions and their $5 million of IT requests, we then had to turn back to them and say, okay, and we have $1.7 million of ongoing recurring revenue that can support any new adds to the budget. And this year we worked very, very hard to get expenditures in line with that revenue forecast. So $1.7 million is not a lot for the needs that I think we were trying to meet this year.
Questions?
Great. That's it. I thought it would be on the quick side. I don't think next Monday will be quite as fast. And
Got it.
hopefully you'll hear from other people besides me next week.
I feel bad that members of the public left maybe only 15 or 20 minutes before. Had they stayed a little longer, they could have a comment, but oh well. All right, well, thank you very much.
Sure.
Do you want to talk a little bit, give us a little bit of a heads up for the next one?
Sure. So we will be spending more time talking about expenditures. We will be covering the new staffing requests. Can you pull that up real quick and take a look at that first page? The 29th. Yeah, the calendar will work, that annotated one. So we'll be talking about the biggest changes on the expenditure side. So we'll talk about staffing costs. There were very limited number of regulatory changes that dictated additions to the budget, so we won't have much to report on that front, where past years we have. We will be also, no, down one more, 29th. We're going to cover department work plans, so you'll get a sense of what we've put in the budget. In particular, where we've also included professional services in order to support those tasks. We're going to cover some of the things that weren't included in the base budget, and we're going to maybe talk a little bit about if those are high priorities for council and community, ways that we could do some of those by utilization of fund balance. And we will start to scratch the surface, I believe, on capital projects and debt assumptions. I expect that conversation to carry over to the next work session, because we have some significant gaps in our capital planning.
Councilmember Winterstein?
Yeah, one comment, one question. My comment is, there's a lot to like in this budget as proposed. And I do appreciate the very clear policy objective of making sure that our ongoing expenditures are covered by ongoing revenues. And then to deliver something that meets that objective, that makes things a lot easier. And so I'm pleased with that. My question is, and you started to address it, Emily, right here at the end, and I feel like I should know the answer to this, so it's a little bit revealing, a little bit embarrassing, I guess. We start by saying, at the state level, we know they do an operational budget, and completely separate, they do a capital budget. And ours are rather weaved in between. It seems that we have a capital plan that has projects, expenditures, timelines, and revenue sources, but then it's every year, I think, within this operational budget that we take a slice out, part of what we call this operational budget, there's a slice of it is, oh, by the way, this is the part that's going to implement this year's capital plan.
Right.
And I guess I do understand it. My ask then would be the more clear that delineation could be made, the better. It would be great to be able to, if I could say clearly, like, okay, so in front of us right now is the question of approval for a capital plan for this part of for the 2019, whatever that is now, even if there's some carryover from 2018 or what have you. I can say, in front of us, here's a part that's for capital for 2019. And I can then open up that capital budget book at any time and say, this is what we're talking about funding, unless there may be some changes, of course.
Yeah.
But that, I guess, so that's my ask much as anything, because I know historically, we've taken capital and we will see those plans at a department level, for example, or there might be, and then streets might be off by itself and some other things. But it was never been easy to see all of capital in one place.
Sure.
And I think with the capital plan that we have, with seeing the funding part that we work on right now, it should be, hopefully, it should be just very easy to line things up and say, here's the question in front of us for funding to do this part of our capital plan.
Yeah. So I think it's easy to see the picture. I think it will be a much more difficult conversation to have about how we're going to proceed with the capital plan for 2019. So let me give you an example. When we adopted the capital improvement plan, there were 3 projects shown in 2019, which at that point was year 2 of the plan, that were unfunded in whole or in part. So those projects have not technically been included in this proposed budget because they were unfunded. And then, just to add a layer of complexity so that you have an idea of why I think it's going to take a couple meetings at least, and why I'm going to suggest we may even have to extend the conversation on the capital component of the budget beyond budget adoption, perhaps, is because we've also had, things have happened between now and adoption of the capital budget. So for example, we have a project where we had anticipated it would be fully funded, maybe, but that was dependent upon getting a grant that we did not get. So now that gets added to the unfunded list. And the work plan in that implementing department included work on that project. And so we need to decide, are we going to allocate to that, and also, both in terms of dollars and staff time, and to what end, because we didn't receive the grant that really enables that whole next phase of that project to go. So I'm sharing this only because where I sit, it looks fairly complex, and it seems like we could probably get bogged down in a conversation about how to go about funding capital. Some of those gaps are quite large and may not be able to be satisfied through a single funding source, or a funding source that would not require voter approval, for example.
Thank you. We did have the financial retreat, right? So the picture of having a capital plan that's not fully funded is not news to anybody.
Correct.
So my bad for not saying that earlier. I recognize, I know that with this operational budget, there are not going to be capital dollars in this budget to do everything that we had adopted in our capital plan. But I did try to slip in there, and changes, because I know changes happen. So aside from this exercise we're going through now, I am anticipating, and I don't think this is news at all, that there will be another stream in which we do make a decision or not about another funding source to cover the known gap at least just for transportation projects. So I know that. So I don't expect there to be revenue to line up for all the anticipated expenditures, and I do expect there to be potential changes. I'll leave it up for you to how to package and deliver that, but it would be good, this is a good marker and a good place at which to have a nice summary of the capital picture.
Yes.
There are planned projects, there's expenditures, there are things relative to budget that they've already done, and then here's the revenue we have in this budget, and here's maybe our updated forecast of what the gap would be. That would be very helpful.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Sorry, thank you for that, Councilmember Winterstein. Councilmember Ramos.
Yes, thank you. So just kind of clarity in other words. So positions that we approved like this last year, such as additional police officers and so forth, those are all included in this base budget, if you will, or preliminary budget. And with all those changes, then there's the 1.7 million in additional revenue that then we're going to see when you bring it is additional things, mainly to the operating budget, additional positions you talked about, staffing, operation tools, those people tools thing are going to come into this 1.7 million, right? And then to lead off on that, and then we're going to look at that capital side, because those are the ongoing costs and revenue, and then looking at ending fund balance or other ways to fund some of those capital things that we talked about, such as things that might have gotten unfunded, places we may got grants we didn't expect, whatever, all those pictures into the capital side, we'll be digging into another side of that, not including the 1.7 million, because that's more towards the operational tools and people side, correct?
Correct.
Thank you, just clarifying.
Recurring, right?
Yeah.
Other comments, questions? A couple things. First off, thank you and your staff. This is a good start. There's a lot of new faces involved in the budget this year, and it's just one person's opinion that it's going very smoothly given all the new people involved in the budget. But of course, we'll see how subsequent meetings go. I also want to mention that our next meeting for the council is tomorrow. We've got a council committee of the whole meeting at 6:30 p.m. here in council chambers. It's not projected to be a super long meeting, but you never know till it ain't over till it's over.
Great, thank you. The only thing that you triggered a memory for me, I had hoped as we were kind of talking about new format and new process and multi-year, multi-step improvements that we're undertaking. Part of how we are going to get better at this each year is, of course, getting this feedback from all of you about what you would like to see, how you would like to see it, or Councilmember Ray had offered previously a couple of suggestions on report formatting. Any of that we'll take, and as we're able to implement them, we shall.
Thank you. That we are adjourned.
Thanks.